Okay, so welcome. We're going to be looking at a couple of things. We're going to look at some design concepts. And then after looking at those design concepts, then we're going to start looking at some commercials. And because I think it's important for you to have a perspective that you're coming from. And um, so let's move ahead. Now, looking at this image, what do you see in front of you?
A man framed by an archway on a walkway.
Okay.
And a little kid? Is that a kid?
Okay, and there's a little boy. Okay, now
Oh, someone's standing on the box.
why is it that you saw the man more clearly? I mean, why
Because
was
he's
that the
center.
first thing? Okay, it's close to center, but he's also pretty much
Oh no, it's
frame.
the lines.
Well,
It's
It's the
it's
lines.
it's the
okay,
contrast also. I mean,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
the uh, the archway is framed in the white with, and then the guy is standing right in the center with the contrast, being with a black jacket and blue pants or what have you.
great. Okay, yeah, all right. And so we have a frame within the image, right? We also have now. How about well, I heard the idea of the line. So we, yes, we do have the lines. We have both the vertical lines that are kind of leading in a path toward him, and also changing in scale. Right?
Deep
They're
space.
changing in perspective. To
Yes.
yes, to give you an idea that what's that telling us?
But there's depth.
Correct, correct. So we get the idea that there's depth and space, and if another clue is that those what do the horizontal lines do for us?
Movement.
Their
The
movement.
Yeah, and you see the
Uh-huh.
little boy, his feet look like they're walking kind of, so that gives you movement also between the steps and the little boy's the positioning of his feet.
Uh-huh. Okay. And so now as we move deeper and deeper into the image, we have a series of horizontal lines that become progressively smaller and smaller in distance between them, correct? So that's another reference to, it's another depth cue that helps us to see a change of scale. Um, but also they serve as kind of a pattern that our eye can follow as we go deeper and deeper into the shot, right? Um,
Mm.
how about the how about the tonal values? What do those do for us?
It's very stark contrast. I mean, you basically it's black and white, with blacks and whites. So it's the kind of the ultimate contrast there.
Hmm.
Which
Okay,
I can't remember what the rule was, but do darks recede and lights come forward?
that is true in some cases, and in the case of there's another function or principle, and it's called atmospheric perspective.
Oh, that's it.
And this is a depth cue.
Hmm.
Uh, if you think about it, when on a foggy day,
Hmm.
everything closer to you is richer in color, deeper in
More
tone,
detail.
and then as you go out toward the horizon, what happens to the
fades,
scene?
turns gray and
More
black.
than
Becomes
muted.
lighter, grayer, hazier, right? So
It takes on
Like
the
it
color
fades
of the
away.
atmosphere.
correct. So we have kind of that same effect here where we have deeper tones toward us and then gradually going toward a lighter and lighter background. So so that gives us another sense that there's some depth here, that the building back there is also further away from us. Um, now, um, as your eye goes in, your eye is immediately led to the man, and then you see where the man's looking, and that what is that? What would we call that? That relationship between the boy and the man. Well, um, in film production, we could consider that to be his eye lines.
Uh,
That's where he's looking. Um, Now notice up to the boy's left, what do you see?
Another man.
Oh,
Woman.
oh well, a woman, yes. And so we don't see this figure quite as quickly, but now we have a relationship between the man, the boy, and the woman, and then back to the man. And so lines, even imaginary lines, can create shape. So we have the idea that there are imaginary lines and then there are real lines, lines that we can follow and see. Um, but if we have a road winding out into the distance, we can see that road curving and creating an S shape. If we have telephone lines, going in the background, dipping and so forth, you can see those lines as also creating uh, lines within our scene. Even though we know if we get up close to those, they're not lines. They're actual objects. They're things. Even telephone poles far in the background are just a very thin line. So let's go ahead and move ahead. You can see that there's a lot within any image that we can draw on. Um, how about repetition of form? Do you see any forms, shapes repeated?
The arc.
The arch, yes. And you see the larger arc, and then you see the smaller arc behind the man, and then of course above you see those shapes repeated. Often we find this in good architecture, where there's a well-designed repetition of form. And think about this when you're out there looking for a shot. Look for these elements, look for these things that can create interest. Um, look for different ways to frame your shot. Look at all of the elements that kind of lead the audience where you want them to be focused at that moment in that shot. So, having said that, let's move on, and we're gonna move on to some general ideas. If you're a filmmaker, and I use this in the broadest sense, a digital filmmaker or a motion picture filmmaker, you're a designer. And as a designer, you have to learn that craftsmanship. You have to learn to give attention to the theme first, to the story, and then you also have to give attention to the details of your shot. And lastly, you have to create this design equilibrium or balance to all of the elements in such a way that it leads your audience right to and focuses in on the thing that you want your audience to see. Rudolf Arnheim is a well-respected theorist on art and visual perception. In his book, Art and Visual Perception, he says that visual perception involves conceptual, creative, and organizational forces. Conceptual, creative, and organizational forces. Conceptual meaning it's our minds, it's a thought process. And creative is that passion and energy to create. And then finally, we have to be able to pull that together, pull those thoughts, that passion, everything else, and organize it in a way that it communicates. So composition could be considered our tendency toward organization in art. If we look at nature might at first look very chaotic when we're looking at it from a distance, from a large macro scale. But of course, we find that the closer we get into it, it has great design, and even finding little details of things can be wonderfully interesting to photograph. we can look at something photographically that looks very chaotic and doesn't seem to have a focus within the frame. In other words, in this image, it's like exploding out of the frame. So this is what we might consider an open composition. There is nothing containing this. It's exploding out in all directions, and it's got energy going in all kinds of directions. On the other hand, we could draw some focus in on it, and now we have an image that even though it has very organic shapes, we have the same elements within the frame. Now we've created a sense of logic or design to it. So do you see that?
Mhm.
And so one photographer that you might look at who really focused in on the idea of imposing order through composition, looking at nature's chaos and then finding this physical order to it, finding an interesting compositional um, um, an artistic um, viewpoint that imposed order on the chaos. And that's Elliot Porter. He's a well-known photographer. When we build, and in our natural world, in our not natural, in our constructed world, let's say, we impose order on inorganic materials through design, right? So the inorganic, of course, is the marble, the concrete, um, wood supports, framing, everything else. Um, and it pleases our eye when we see a certain order to things. But we also have to add other things to it. What makes this shot interesting to you when, if it was just a square, a rectangular building with no variation to it, what makes this different from that idea?
Hmm?
What makes this building design different from, say, just a rectangular building with consistently even
The
window spacing?
Well, the dome makes it different, and the pillars definitely make it. The pillars kind of just they make it stand out, make it majestic.
Uh-huh. Very good.
First thing
Very
I
good.
think is all the different geometric. I mean, it's you have the pillars, and you have a triangle snapped on top of the
Right.
pillars, and the triangle is kind of set within a rectangle. And then above that is you've got the dome. So I mean, it's just got then you have square windows, rectangles. I mean, it's all rectangle doors. I mean, it's just very geometric.
Right. And at the same time, there's a certain rhythm to the arrangement of things too. So you have visual movement across that image. This, by the way, is by a well-respected uh, Florida architect, actually originally from Chicago. Um, and this is the state, the Supreme
Capitol building.
Court, Supreme Court building in Tallahassee, Florida, where they had the famous, what they call that? The debate over those little pieces of paper that, in the
Hanging Chad.
Oh.
Hanging Chad. This is the place where that debate took place. The Hanging
infamous
Chad.
Tallahassee
Yes.
Courthouse.
Yes, the infamous. Um, so the principles of composition and design, these are our grammar or the symbols of our visual language. So if we learn what these are, then we can apply them. It's like just learning how to do anything. Once you know what these pieces and parts are, you can start to apply them in very creative groupings or arrangements. And we'll get into that as we get to the end of this. These principles help us to organize the visual elements into a pleasing and comprehensive whole. Now, this is a really big idea. it was put forth by the Gestalt theorists around the 1920s, and it became a basis of our whole culture of modern art and modern design. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and you're going to find that that applies very much to filmmaking. You're going to be shooting separate shots, little pieces, views and angles this way and that way, little parts of a, you're going to be breaking up a whole performance into various angles and then trying to put that all together. But when you put it all together, if it's done well, it's so much more than the individual shots. And the things that you put into your frame, into your individual shots, are also much greater than, when you see that as a whole, it's much stronger than each individual element. It's stronger than that camera movement. It's stronger than the actor going from background on an angle into the foreground into a close-up. It's stronger than the light that's fading, that's graduating from shadows to light behind the actor. And it's stronger than that doorway that's placed just in the right place to make it an interesting composition with the actor in the left and the doorway in the right. So this principle can be used in many different ways as you go through and think out this whole process of design. Now, of course, when we look at a composition, we're not picking it apart. We grasp it as a whole and we see it in its completeness. And so, in a way, it defines the audience's point of view. When you look at this image, you first see the shapes, right? You see the shapes, you see the light, differences of light. Yes?
Yes.
And then you begin to do what? You begin to work up a story about what's happening there, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, there's some very, you've got that one figure deep in the background that seems to be running forward. You've got these people walking off with these apparently heavy loads of, it looks like colored fabrics and so forth. So I mean, as the audience, we try to picture what these pieces mean as we get them. We also respond to a situation, to the images that we see based on our experiences. How many of you have been on a snowy field and know what that feels like and know what it looks like and know how cold it is? And then when you look at this image, you have that perception. You are putting more into it than simply the image itself, right?
Yeah, I think of the crunching of the sound.
Oh yes, the crunching of the snow as you're walking
Yeah.
down. Yeah. So imagery also brings with it our personal experiences. And here's another thing that you can add to this. Your personal experiences inform the way you put images together. The things that you find interesting or draw you are probably going to be drawn from the depths of your own experience as well. Sometimes you're experimenting with things way outside your experience level, but many times we respond as well as photographers, as cinematographers, to the things that we're accumulating in terms of our own life experience as well. So we respond with our emotions because we spend our lives from the time we're little babies to the time we're ready to pass on. We spend our lives looking at faces and interacting with people. So we also bring to any situation or to any arrangement of figures or expressions or movements of an actor, we bring our own responses to what that means and what it means to us. Um, And finally, our experiences inform our perceptions. Um, for example, are we looking up or down?
At first, I thought it was looking forward instead of up or down.
Aha, interesting. Yeah. But based on your knowledge of the world and your experience of navigating places, what does it tell you now?
I think
You're
it's
looking down.
down. Yeah, down.
Yeah, I mean, this is almost like a Escher-esque kind of an image. It kind of fools you at first because of the kind of forced perspective, um, the bending of the angle. But still, it's interesting. We almost see the photographer's foot or something there, just under the like
Mhm.
fourth bar from the right. But anyway, so we understand the geography of the world, and yet when we put a lens up to that world and start looking through, we change the way it is, because for one thing, we're including some things, but with the rest of it, we're excluding it. The audience has no idea what's just to the right of this image, right? Or to the left or behind us.
Mhm.
There could be an elephant behind us, but we'd never know, would we? So, but you get my point. When we look at things, we we have an impression of what it is, where we are, and by the images. Let's say we have a sequence of shots. We're going to create or construct a world based on the shots that are revealed to us by the cinematographer, director, and cinematographer, right?
Right.
So that's an interesting thing too. That helps us to kind of realize that we're kind of we're like fantasy world makers. Every time we put two shots together, we're going to create a response in our audience. If you haven't ever read about it, read up on Kuleshov, who is a Russian editor. He came up with some interesting theories about um, how humans respond to edited sequences. Okay, um, so we can say that our responses are both subjective and they're experiential.
Mhm.
Composition also reflects something else. It reflects our intention. Remember what I said about showing the audience only certain pieces of the scene? We're extracting from the scene a worldview, but we're also eliminating from what the audience is going to see a certain amount of that, and we're doing it so that we can control how the audience experiences that. Do you understand what I'm saying? So the question is, what's our purpose and meaning in creating the image and in putting together this sequence of different images? Now, sometimes it's about a particular shot or scene, and how by putting together certain things in combination, like for example, in this scene, there's a lot of movement. Um, there's a bit of like visual chaos to all of the physical movement in this shot. And is that movement only, is it flat from what you understand? Is this a flat looking scene, or do you have
Well,
a sense of depth to it?
well, you have the people in the foreground.
Okay.
You have people sitting and people in the far back. So I guess that it does have depth, but it's
It,
closed.
it is closed. Okay. It's a closed scene. Um,
It's flat.
it is flat in that uh, we're flat to the wall in the back.
Right. There
But
isn't any frames or any divisions in the frame
yes.
to indicate more depth.
Now, one of the things that I want to point out is that even when you're in a flat look, you have various depth cues that are very useful in the flat look in order to maintain a sense or kind of an artificial depth to the scene. And so, for example, by using the dark contrast of a foreground figure, by creating alternating planes, through division of space, but also layering of planes, we create the sense of depth, even if it's a limited depth. So this is kind of limited space. It's not completely flat.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to tell because of the way they had the gentleman sitting at the table in the foreground.
Yes.
So that's
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
it's almost like you're looking over somebody's shoulder. You're in there.
yeah. This is from the scene, The Deer Hunter. I mean, this is from a scene, which is a very strong scene in that film. Notice the strong yellow, orange, golden color. That gives it a lot of affinity. And also, do you see all the haze and smoke in the background that adds that atmospheric perspective that we were talking about before?
Mm-hmm.
So that gives us kind of a diminishing effect of diminishing depth, or increasing depth rather, even though it's not really that deep. So, okay. So film, we could say, is a synthesis of the visual, the psychological, and our sound elements. We put all those things together in various combinations, and it creates this greater whole. Now let's look at some of the visual structures that we can use. And I've tried to give you kind of a visual representation of that. This is like your toolbox. Do you see that?
That's a cool diagram.
Yeah. And so you can play with line, different shapes, different types of line. That line could be, of course, it could be hard and vertical, or horizontal, or angular, or what have you, and you can change entirely the feeling of that line. You've got tone from dark to light. You've got a story arc that's growing. You can put many of these into one shot. You can put it into a progression of shots. And you can also have an increase of any of them or a decrease of any of them from shot to shot or over a series of shots. So you can see now how just by varying the amount or the intensity of any one of these, you change the whole feeling of the story. See that? Very interesting thought. We have elements that we could call visual elements. These would be things like shape, size, color, texture, tone, and light. We see them, and in a sense, we can, we get a sense of how texture feels. We get a sense of depth and so forth, and shape and size. Okay, but we have to experience these without touching. So these are the visual elements that we have, but they add to every image. We also have conceptual elements, like, for example, remember I said before, you can have eye lines, or you can have diagonal lines that take you off into the distance. Those are conceptual in the sense that there's not a vanishing point out there. If we walked up that subway exit, we wouldn't find the vanishing point at the top, would we? It just wouldn't be there. So we have things like point and line and plane and volume. They're imaginary ideas, but they help us to conceptualize and to understand relationships between things. Notice too, do you see two different visual styles between the two images? And
Yes.
how could you describe those two visual differences? Which side would be a long lens look?
The left side.
Yes. And what tells us that it might be a long lens look.
Yeah, there's more. I guess there's more focus on the center object, and it's like focus clearer in the on on the center object, and kind of more fuzzy out, whereas the other one, the focus is the same throughout the picture.
Okay, well, here's one thing I'll say is that, do you see how in the image on the right, how our view of the world is expanded, it's wider? And look how his hands are almost larger than his face because they're closer to us. So that's a wide angle 18 millimeter look, 18, well, actually it's probably more like a 24 millimeter on 35, but still, it's this wide angle look. Things that are closer to you are more exaggerated than things that are further away. And look at the light pole or so that's out in the parking lot way back there. And look how tiny that looks. Whereas in the image to the left, if you look at the vertical handrail poles, they aren't significantly smaller as they go up, and neither are the steps, not as radically different in scale as the image to the right. And that's in long lens look, which is the image to the left, we have a flattening of the image in the sense that we're magnifying the background. The background then seems or appears to be so much closer to the foreground and so much more similar in size. And that's one way of looking at long lens. There are some other things depending on how close your subject is to you, because then focus comes into play, and then we have blurring of the background as the subject comes closer. Now, here's a set of ways to describe things in shots that all have to do with energy. They have to do with visual dynamics. Dynamics, like a dynamo or dynamism. All of these things have to do with movement, placement, space, weight, tension, gravity, energy. And so you can see that you can also have these elements or not have them in a single image. Finally, we also have to look at the idea that we have structural elements. When we talk about format, when we talk about time within a story, when we talk about the theme, the trajectory of the story, the trajectory of the image, the arc of the story, and then of course the sequence itself as a building block. When we talk about this, we can see then that structural elements can inject in this group of images that you're putting together some kind of order, but also there's the plane of time and space that becomes very important in taking your audience from one moment to the next. So it's ways we build, we construct, we form, we arrange in order to make a logical sense to the audience, but also to expand or contract time and space, and to draw the audience toward a particular story point. So just like in screenwriting, you do that in different ways. We do it as well visually. So here's just a view in these next two slides of many references that we can use to visual design. And if you get to know each of these terms, then I think you're going to have a much broader, wider vocabulary to work with. You're going to see that that there are nuances to everything. Okay, now someone said that in this whole thing about synthesis, there's something else though that we add into the image. It's not just structure, it's not just this visual play, but there's also three different things that we're going to add to it: thought, passion, and wisdom. Salvador Dali said to see is to think, and by that he means you have to think, you have to plan, you have to see beyond what's just coming at you. And then you have to form an opinion about it. In other words, you're going to include or exclude things. You're going to balance it out with this object and that object and so forth. So there's the idea of seeing being a process of thinking. Then there's injecting passion, into your art. Because if you don't have a point of view, if you don't have something that you're bringing to it, there's an interesting thought that I've read recently in a book on photography. One of the 10 building blocks of making yourself a great photographer or cinematographer is to follow your passion. Follow the things that you are passionate about, and draw on those. Draw on those in your work and in your life, and you'll be so much more happy. And then lastly, it's the idea of wisdom. How much is enough? When do we apply some creative wisdom to what we're putting together, as opposed to simply just running amok and throwing all kinds of visual elements into a scene, throwing in a great dolly shot when that shot's never going to see the light of day because it's too long. Various things like that. We have to think about the edit. We have to think about the end result, and we have to think about its impact to the story. So in summary, we can say that form and function, the form of the film and the function of it, they should be together. They should be joined. And then we can say also that these are pieces that we can interactively work with. They're not rigid rules. They're something to help us define our ideas and reach in and say, okay, this is what I want to do, and this is why I want to do it at this moment. And sometimes you don't know why, but you've internalized. After a time, you're going to internalize all of these ideas, and you're going to end up with your own guidelines, what out of your gut is going to work for that shot. And that's where you want to be, is you want to be at the point where you're not thinking actively as you're setting up a shot, but you're doing, and it's coming, right through your mind, through all of your input, and it's coming out in the work that you accomplish. Style. You hear talk about what I'm going to have a style just like that guy. I want to have, I like this film and that's my style. I want to do that. Well, style is always going to depend on the subject, the location, and then of course, story, composition, movement, and light. You can put all of those same elements together and hand it off to 3 or 4 cinematographers or directors, and you're going to end up with 3 or 4 different stories. They're not going to all be the same. So here are some basics on what your design principles are. There's the idea of unity and harmony. And under unity and harmony come the ideas of affinity and contrast, theme and variation. And second, we have the idea of balance and equilibrium. We're going to look at these. And then we have scale and proportion, color and tone, rhythm, texture, and pattern. We have the idea of expression as well as limitation. Expression is of course, it's your unique expression of an idea. Limitation is limiting your expression to certain variables so that your ideas aren't diluted by too much. Next, we have perspective and viewpoint. And this becomes a very important point when you're working as a cinematographer. Placing the camera in the right position for that shot is going to define your composition from one moment to the next. Whether that camera is moving, whether the actors are moving, whether you're just simply watching something happen and unfold in front of you. But deciding on the perspective, deciding on that viewpoint, and then learning how to modify that or change it from shot to shot or even within a shot is part of the task of being a good cinematographer. And then, of course, learning to use the spatial depth cues like light, atmosphere gradation, position, framing, and point of view. And then injecting energy into your scene and allowing for growth being a change from one moment to the next. Growth is change. And then finally, movement and direction and dominance. Dominance has a lot to do with the idea of emphasizing one thing over another, selecting what your audience is going to see, creating a foreground, middle ground, background, and drawing your audience to one part of that foreground, middle ground, background. Okay, so this takes us to the end of our first section, and so we're going to move on to the next set. Okay, so if you look at this slide, this image, I've tried to define this as a series of principles that are the most important principles that you might want to apply. And that being unity and variety, balance, proportion, dynamism, tension, emphasis, rhythm, movement, and of course, finally, the idea of limitation. We're going to look at where this has come from and what some of the underlying psychological and physiological responses that we have to certain design principles. Okay, so question is, how does the brain organize our visual information into different categories or groups? Now, just looking at this, do you see relationships between some of the elements on this slide and other elements? Does your mind automatically put certain things together or create shapes, or or you just see text?
You read, left to right.
Yes.
Yeah, but you also put the different colors together, like
yes.
Does human stand out? The phrase
yeah.
does human.
Yeah. And and there's
shapes.
So there's a shape there with does human visual categories, and then there's that brain organize information into or groups shape. There's also the idea here of things in front and things behind. So we have the question mark in front of the yellow shape, which is a little darker. The lighter shape of the question mark coming forward. So yes, our brain does look at things and then decides where everything is in space and decides, how does this feel? Does it feel off kilter or does it feel balanced? And it does this in split seconds too, microseconds.
Doesn't it kind of decide also what you see first?
Yes, absolutely. And there are certain, and in fact, that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at in a few minutes is what are those things. I'm going to give you 10 principles of emphasis, how you certain techniques that you can use to create emphasis. So unity in design. So we're talking about the idea of unity and how and why the elements of design are synthesized into these patterns. Okay, so there was a lot of thought about this, and they came up with these main principles: closure, continuance, similarity, proximity, alignment, and then figure and ground. Okay, and we'll look at what each of those is. Closure. It's the idea that if we objects could be deconstructed into groups of smaller parts. Okay, and so your brain here is probably seeing a pattern. And how would you describe that pattern? What do you see here?
You have an overlapping pattern of 6. Actually,
Yes.
that's what it looks like, an overlapping pattern of 2, 6. Yeah.
Yes, and it's interesting that you say overlapping pattern. You either see the smaller dots as forward, but more likely you see them as receding, right? Because of scale.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's another part to this. We also, through closure, we want to fill in that missing information and create a shape. So for example, we have somewhat rectangular shapes there, and we have a circular shape here. So it's the idea that your brain will fill in some of the missing information. And then not only will it fill in that information, but it'll begin to align those items and take those items that are closer to each other in proximity and decide that they belong to be grouped together. So now we have a visual line of cars coming from the right, and we have a visual line of cars coming from the left, and then and of course we have this other group or block of cars that's in the background, and so forth. We also can see relationships to things that are disconnected, right? So, and part of that's experiential, isn't it? So looking at the feet, do we recognize that the shadows belong to the feet?
Definitely.
Yeah, yeah, but it's also because of our experience in the world, and we understand shadow to be a function of light at a certain time of day, and so we understand then that those feet shapes are connected. How about this one? This is the idea of continuance, and if we give the eye an uninterrupted view, to where we can go all the way down that line until we run into something, that's what our mind is going to do. It's going to continue until it finds an obstacle, and then it's going to look for some continuation of that line. Okay. Another aspect of this is eye direction, and we talked about in the very first shot. So wherever the subject is looking, we create this imaginary line to the complementing close-up of the other person, right? Or we may connect this shot to a shot out where we see a window and we see the scene outside the window and we see someone outside the window, and we might connect that, okay, this person is looking out the window at that other person, right? So it's virtual eye lines that are being created from a dominant subject. Now, similarity is has to do with the grouping or selection of shapes or tones or colors or sizes that are similar. So our mind's going to find the things that are most similar and put them together, but also put them together in terms of qualities, like tone and color and shape and size. And then similarity can also mean that we might have a relationship between a group of similar items in a composition. So we see those similar items as being all part of one. So if that was a flock of geese, we might see that as a flock. You know, figure and ground has to do with what you notice first, and then ground is everything else. Figure is what you see, ground is what's the background. And when you look at anything, like you could experiment with this. Look around the room and select something that's the focus of your attention. And in that moment, does your mind not kind of move everything else out of the way so that you don't really look at everything else that's in your view? You your mind closes in on that object as if it's really closer to you. And that's kind of the idea of. And now with lenses, we can do that, but you're so used to seeing with this very wide vision that you have, you don't see what your mind, how your mind is selecting just part of that scene for a moment. To the extent that, if you're watching television across the room, you can tune out everything else around the television and be just focused on that. And in your imagination, that's all you see. But you can play with that idea. You can play on that idea and use that to your advantage in design. Now, because I can't play this, I can't show you. But I had various. I had like black and white shapes, and so you're looking at a shape. You're looking at a letter N. And then there are color shapes on either side. Now, when that is a black N on white, then it looks like the white is in the front, in the foreground, and it separates the black N from that white. When it became all a solid color, then with red and black, then the black became dominant. But then with these colors, now you have each color has a dominance to it. So would you say that the green or the magenta is more dominant?
Green.
Yes. And so as we go toward the blue tones, we go from warm to cool. And the magenta, of course, is actually a cool color because it's on the blue side of red. If that was red, do you think the green or the red would be more dominant?
Red's almost always more dominant.
Yes, it is. So it's the relationship of the objects in the frame that's going to draw your eye to something or another. And so there we have sort of a psychological foundation for the way we perceive things. And we see this work, time and again. We can apply it to any image. Visual coherence is the idea that when we put together similarities within an image, it helps to hold that image together. So, for example, and that's the idea that Bruce Bloch discusses in terms of affinity. So affinity of tone, affinity of color, affinity of line, and various things like that. That is very much in line with the idea of visual coherence. Now, the other thing that's at play here, though, is also a visual contrast. So there's contrast and affinity at work at the same time. So an interesting design, this in this image. Here, look at the design of the image gives unity, and the arches draw and connect both sides. The cool blue sets off the center gold. The gold seems to want to come forward, but doesn't it seem like this has been kind of flattened because you've got the warmer color, which would normally be forward, all the way back, and you've got the cooler colors in the foreground. And that's kind of a common theme in design of a flat image is that you'll play on these things that are contrary to the normal idea of what's warm is forward and what's cool is distant. When you turn that on its head, it helps to create contrast in an interesting way. And so you can play with some of those ideas by doing the opposite of what you would normally do with that particular principle. Coherence can be making everything similar in tone, color, size, texture. And again, we're talking in Bruce Bloch's language, affinity. Harmony has to do with a cohesive whole. So when everything holds together, the textures, the design, there's a balance of relationship, a balance between harmony and variety, then we have unity in the image. Variety, of course, is when we have differentiation, something that, boom, draws our eye into it. We have a lot of similarity, and we have, you can see that we have, several Gestalt principles at work here because we have similarity of shape and grouping of those shapes. But at the same time, we have a dissimilar, very red image with the gloves that's contrasting with that and providing variety, and it's breaking up what might have been a so-so grid-like image. Here's an image where you can see how in the design of this image, I'm going to actually, let me do something here. Illustrate something. Oops. Okay, need to go higher. Okay, here we are. So if I reduce the opacity of that, you can see, the image doesn't have a triangle over there, but we've defined that shape as being a triangle, and you can see how that leads you and pushes you in toward the subject. And there's a balance of like 1/3 to 2/3, even though it's on a diagonal. And so that diagonal has a certain energy to it. But look at the other lines that are also reinforcing that energy. There's the eye line look off to the girl's right. There's the angle of the hand and wrist that point in toward the face. There's the axis of the face in alignment with the axis of the arm, and so forth. There's different things that help this design to hold together. And so when you're placing, when you're working with actors or models, think about the kind of space that they occupy in your frame. How's that balancing out, and and what's at work to make it a strong image or weaken the image? If we had taken and moved the camera over to the right and put her face more center, would it have had the same feeling? It would have been a different image, wouldn't it? And so we've talked about the idea of coherence, or getting a congruity or agreement of the elements in the frame, and also the idea of those elements having a purpose. Unity with variation. Unity is harmony, and variation is adding interest and adding pace, or some energy or dynamism to the image. And then finally, we're gonna get into next. We're gonna add some information about the idea of clarity. You want what you're creating to be clear, to meet the audience's expectations, but at the same time, through the concept of contrast and affinity, we can add some little spice and surprises to what their expectations are. But we have to kind of meet in a middle ground where there's a starting point where we can communicate with them, and then we can take them somewhere. But if you can't connect, then you've got a problem. So that's an important part of commercials, is being able to connect. And the other thing is, what are the structural norms? What's the audience used to? How are they going to understand when you do something? One of the big things is, I think I see an awful lot of students taking their camera and acting as if it's a handy cam, as like they're doing home movies, and they just point it wherever on a wide lens, and that's not using your decision-making abilities. That's not defining when, how, why, and where you're going to move the camera in a specific way, or focus and frame in on one specific idea, and then over here on a different idea when you change angles. So I think it's getting some clarity to what you're doing, and also knowing how you want to move your audience from shot to shot. That's a very important thing. And last of all, the idea that we're throwing out here is that chaos is the contrast to order. Sometimes you create chaos in order to contrast it with the order that you're going to bring things to at another time. And there are some masters at doing this. Let's move into our last set of slides here, and then we're going to look at some commercials. Okay, so now we're talking about balance, and the question is, what's balance? Well, it's an equilibrium of the elements. One of the things that comes into play with our idea of equilibrium is we understand what gravity is and what physical mass is. So if a shape looks triangular, then we're going to expect that triangular shape to be weighted more at the bottom because it's bigger at the bottom. So that affects our visual impression of the balance of things. Certain parts of an image can assume emphasis, and we can arrange them so that they seem to be in or out of balance, or to have one kind of balance or another. Symmetry is one of the first principles of balance, and a formal balance is, think Wes Anderson, think Kubrick. Very formalized, structured, centered imagery. Okay. around a central axis. There's a lot of symmetry in the work of Wes Anderson. Sometimes that's approximate symmetry where you have an equal amount of balance from one side to the other, and you're going to find many cinematographers and directors work in this way. They'll put a certain amount of weight over here of these objects and a certain amount of weight of these objects on the other side. And then there's such a thing as informal balance, where you have a dominant form that's offset by many smaller forms. Okay, and so we can see this in many different things. Here's an image that is kind of an approximate symmetry because the background elements, they're different from one side to the other, but the overall feel is of a symmetrical split image with man on the right, woman on the left. But it's the unity of the colors surrounding them that help to tie together the background, even though those shapes and are different. And of course, the differences in the shapes in the background add some visual interest to it. Is this balanced or imbalanced? Knowing what you know about life, is that going to be balanced or not?
Not.
Not. And this? Most likely. It, a little bit of weight out there and a little offset from the center point can balance that way. And visually, it gives us a sense that there is a certain balance to this, even though it seems unstable. A little bit unstable, doesn't it? And then here, is that an expectation? The red on the right has such a dominant color that it draws some attention to itself, even though you've got a bigger sizes in the other shapes, doesn't it? But the other two shapes help to balance it out and give it some coherence. It's not really fully balanced there. But this, what do you think is, what's your impression of what's happening here?
My first
Looks
thought
like
is
the
it
red ball
falls.
was dropping down.
Something's about to happen.
Yes,
Yeah.
it does look like something's going to. So we're creating a sense of anticipation by the way we've designed and put these elements together, right? So keep in mind that the way you balance out a scene can also affect the way what the audience is going to expect to happen in the next part. You can have a scene that's nicely formally balanced, but then you move an element in a way that it now is a different kind of balance, or it's suddenly eccentric or off balance, right? Asymmetrical balance, yes. We have a balance of the light to the left and the subject to the right of the middle. Okay. Radial balance would be where we've got a balance out in all directions from a central point. It would be like the image of the rose window at Notre Dame, or looking up at the Eiffel Tower. Okay, or looking down a staircase where you've got a round staircase where you see it spiraling down and down and down. Here, from a top view, is it balanced? Seems somewhat out of balance. Yeah, little odd. I mean, there's something strange and odd going on here from this point of view and from the design. I mean, if you look at it, it's a radial balance, but it's not because of the positioning of some of the other elements in the scene and because of the light. So you can see how light and movement of your subjects within a framing can dynamically change the way it looks. Again, symmetrical, almost radial, but again, you've got some emphasis to the left. And notice what they did in spacing some of the subjects on the right in order to offset or balance the character that's standing to the left. And also notice the light that's over to the right to balance out the subject that's in the middle. Here, a silhouette, fairly symmetrical. Okay, so let's look at, remember I said we'd look at 10 different ways to control emphasis. So let's do that. Emphasis being any forcefulness that gives importance or dominance to some feature or features of an artwork. Okay, so something that's singled out by means of counterpoint, stress, contrast, anomaly for an aesthetic impact. So here's our first technique. Emphasis through contrast. Okay. Here we've created emphasis through contrast, yes? This is, of course, a little contrastier than the original film, but still, we're very focused in on that brightest point in the middle of that scene that's framed in by the door and the character on the right. Okay. Emphasis through scale. So as things recede in scale, we tend to see the larger object more emphasized in the foreground. Okay. Emphasis through shape. So we notice now, even though this is similar to this, but we notice what? That the round shape is different. Emphasis through isolation. So we have a lot of similar shapes, but then we've got one shape that's doing something different. Now, you can think of this as well as a character moving or doing something or standing apart from a group of other people. Okay. Here's an example of dominance. So you have a foreground dominant character, you have the midground, you have the background, and then of course you've got your deep background, and you have all those lines curving and pointing out deep into the background, but also lines that are drawing you back out to your principal character. Look at the way they position the police car on the left and the police car on the right. They're angled in, pointing almost towards your lead character, right? Anybody recognize this? This is Popeye Doyle from The French Connection. Emphasis through angles and planes. So creating emphasis by using perspective lines to draw you into something. And and of course you could say also repetition of form leading you toward a similar form would work that way too. Emphasis through tangent. So everything is all nice and orderly, but you've got these certain things that are out of order, and so you see them immediately, right? Yes? Okay. Light, of course, tonal differences can draw your interest. Light. So are there some different techniques being used in this? There are lines that draw your interest into the center. There's contrast. There's dark against light. There's the focus of light and so forth. Emphasis through motion. So in this, if you're watching the scene, you're going to see motion drawing your eye and following the characters. And then finally, our last principle is emphasis through growth and recognition. So we have this shadowy shape, and as the sun comes up, that shadowy shape becomes recognizable. The audio is interesting because they have the car accelerating and squealing wheels and stuff like that. All the stuff with a hot rod. Um, and the guy is he's saying a few things about AutoZone. Um, and of course, um, anyway, you see where to go. Bigfish.net. Michael Neumann. So you can go there and see the AutoZone commercial and several others of his. But let's take a little quick look. What was the first thing you noticed about this? What drew your imagination first? What was the emphasis?
The color.
Colors, or they pop. But what about? Do you know what we're talking about here yet? Is it about cars? Yeah, but I mean, just in terms of it playing its way through, right away that we're talking about cars, right? And what about the pace? Has it got a certain boom, 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 pace on a certain beat?
Yeah, it seems fast, but it also seems dangerous.
It might, yeah, because the camera's so close in the foreground. Is that why you're thinking that?
No, because of the imagery in it, because you get
Oh
the
yeah,
up close, see the expression on Jesse's face,
yeah,
and with the tattoos so up close, it's
yeah,
all of it makes it just seems it's not just any car. They're like badass cars. It's
yeah,
really
yeah,
it's exciting. It's like it's
yeah.
not AutoZone, it's AutoZone.
AutoZone, yeah. So there's a lot of like visual energy to this, and it's not. I mean, we're not moving the camera a lot necessarily, but the things that you're seeing and the little pieces that are being revealed, it's like this continuous little move, from one shot to the other. So there's a connectedness to the shots. Watch this again. Move to the right, head turn to the right. Yes? See how that worked editorially?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Follow the flow.
Contrast. Oh, and did you see which way did the wheel go? Watch it again. Moved off to the right. Head turned to the right. The arm is coming back towards you, even though it's arcing around in a curve. It's coming to the right. Okay. So, what would Bruce Block call that? It's like a continuum of movement. Okay. So again, we came around to the right to him. Yes. And the camera's moving. Okay. Now, is everything a wide shot?
No.
A
No.
lot of alternation of different focal lengths for dynamism, because this is a real dynamic, heavy duty spot. It's got attitude. And of course, AutoZone, now you're being introduced at how many seconds in? 7 seconds in. Boom. There we are at 9 seconds. Okay, so at 8 or 9 seconds in, now we know it's for sure it's AutoZone, but he said it as well. And nice little close up here. And notice that we've gone from left to right to now from right to left. When he turned that dial from right to left, it changed a certain amount of it is right to left. Notice here also, now this shot they had to do, they're just daylight, balanced light, hot white t-shirt. They didn't put a lot into this shot. But it's probably because they were in a working location. But look at compare the lighting of, okay, look at the light here. It's very shaped, modeled, coming from a Rembrandt angle. You guys had art history, right? So you see that little triangle of light on his left cheek, not camera left, but his left. And then look at the highlights. We're on a long lens in order to throw those highlights out of focus back there, right? And they've got some little hot pieces of light hitting it back there to make it, kind of pop, so that it helps to frame him in, and he's nice and sharp, right? And of course, what do we see down in the bottom left, bottom right corner? Get in the zone. He's advertising the product, right? Now, what I wanted to point out here is a very interesting thing. This, if you've shot car commercials, I've been around a few.
Grip giver.
Look at the reflections. Cars are all about reflections. Look at the reflections here. You're seeing they put that so that you could see the AutoZone logo reflected in the building. I'm sorry, not the building. In the car, in the reflective paint on the car. So in that gloss. And so also notice, are the tires dirty? Not really. No, they're nice and detailed. Everything's detailed. Everything's clean. You don't see a speck of dirt and dust on that car. They've detailed that shot. Something's moving in every shot, right? There's a little movement. It doesn't have to be a big movement, but you want that kind of continuum of movement. You want things to move and flow and move and flow and take you from this shot to that shot. And you got to think about what it is that's going to connect us to the next shot. Because just having two people standing there talking to each other doesn't do it. Some nice stuff there, right?
Yeah.
Nice. I mean, this kind of like a Route 66 looking kind of a thing. They're kind of drawing on that 50s, late 40s, 50s influence as well in the way they've designed some of their shots. But they've really kind of modernized it and beefed up the idea. Now, what would be interesting is to look at a completely different project by the same director. And I'm just going to let you guys go ahead and look at some of these on your own. But do you see how color, contrast, direction of light, the whole continuing the movement, following a particular color theme? Did they put things in there that wouldn't work with the AutoZone sign? No, they were kind of careful about what they would put in the shot. And what time of day is it? Look at the color of the light hitting his face. Look at the horizon out and off to the left. What's happening?
Magic hour.
Magic hour. And that's the time of day when cars just look gorgeous, in terms of the reflected. Even an old car can look good at magic hour. Okay. So some really cool things going on. Okay. Let's I want to show you some other things. So let's go to that was Big Fish. Let's go to Collective, and I want you to notice, look at the pieces in this director's portfolio here. Bath by Johnson's, Body Tonic by Garnier, Brown Eyed Girl Hush Puppies shoes, Comforter by Johnson's, Curls by Garnier, and et cetera, et cetera. So DKNY, sleek. So she's got a niche that she's working, and this is working for her. Um, and these are not, schlock commercials. These are high end products. But let's look at one. Let's try looking at this Garnier commercial.
Because anybody can have cellulite. Garnier reinvents body tonic water with de-stocking caffeine. 1 minute per day. But now you're ready for any position life puts you in. New position training.
Okay, so we know what the product was.
Body tonic?
Yes. Okay, so simple setting. Yes, this woman's sitting out on her back porch or in the yard, writing. Okay, okay. What do we know about her? She a modern girl. Look at her clothes. You know, look at the glasses. Look at the things on the table. What have they done to prop this scene? What about the selection of the pen, even that she's using? Where they place the glasses. The glasses, were they exactly in that place during the previous shot? Yeah, similar,
Yeah.
but different,
Mhm.
upside down.
Nice.
Okay. Okay. And here we don't even see the glasses. But look at the dapples of light on her face. Okay. And it's a little different, because the light's changing. I I think they probably created some foliage there to make that work for them, because look at where the sun is overall.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, okay. So they were running out of early light by the time they got to those shots. Okay. Every shot, there's a little movement in it too. And look at the framing. So she's taken some. Now once they get into the product shots, note how the whole scene changed. It's brighter, lighter colors. It's the exposure is up. Um, there's more of a sharp focus on things. The colors are more subtle. Look at the affinity of color and tone in these product shots, and see how that's and did that shot there connect with that shot? No, but the movement made it flow from that shot to that shot, and the same here, right? So close-ups on the product, and now she comes running out because her papers are running, blowing. Very simple story. Um, it shows that it's her lifestyle. So this is kind of a slice of life lifestyle commercial. You're supposed to identify with the character, have fun the way she's having fun, and look at the product shot. Look how they did a very simple background. They threw it well out of focus, but notice that it's not the same contrast as before. So they've controlled the brightness of the background. Maybe they moved this over somewhere so that it's not quite as hot a background. But see that? So anyway, um, let's. So we're going to move on to. Let's see. Okay. Sony. So the client is Sony. The agency is Frontage. And this is Radical Media. So do you think they wet down the background? I mean, the streets?
Oh yeah.
You bet.
That's high end production, man.
Yeah, they paid for that. Had to shoot it on Sunday. Look at the selection of colors, choreography.
Holy cow! Oh, that's right. I saw.
Crane moving up, jib arm going up, using a Phantom camera to shoot the high-speed shots.
Wow.
Now it's the product shot.
The sweet
Okay.
product.
Yeah. Well, so they had to match frame to the last shot, but it's a freeze frame, so that makes it easy. They had to match at a certain point when they've got it match framed in there, and then they pull out. So that was a little post work to match frame that right into the TV, and then
Have the markers on
make
there.
it look like it worked. Probably didn't have to mark it. You could take the image and lay it in there and then just soften the edges just slightly. At the resolution that the image is, full HD image that they put in there.
Mhm.
And the Phantom actually has, more resolution than just 1920 by 1080. So doing spots is a lot about color, design, movement, shapes. Let's look at another one here. Client is Kasubi. Spot is titled Colors. Looks like this director really likes to do Phantom stuff. Looks like they didn't get the best of light that day, but it's interesting.
I think it looks like them girls need to eat something.
Oh yeah. Now that's timing. Well, these are stunt girls, so, I'm glad they can jump that high. Okay. So, moving on. Anyway, some good design work in the shots. Overall, they've got quite a list of directors. Go to Radical Media and take a look through their list. They've got some recognizable names: Terry Gilliam, Terrence Malick,
wow.
Ron Howard,
What?
as directors. Yeah, Roberto Rodriguez and Robert Rodriguez, and so forth. So. Let's see. We have DNA is another big company. Lots of awards and stuff with these companies. If you look at AICP and go through their member directory,
Okay.
then you can find that was on your list. So that's where all these guys are from. You'll see Big Fish in there. I've done work with Big Fish, with Robert Latour and some other directors, and so you're going to find some really fun stuff out there if you go and look. Moxie Pictures is another. They've got some current spots that are fun to watch. Skittles, McDonald's, Tourism Australia. But take a look at, try to separate what's what in each piece. Break it down. What makes that work? What were you can probably say there are three things that are focused on in just about every spot. What's the main thread and what are the two interlocking threads? What are the things that they've done to pull that story out? Here we've got Errol Morris. I'm going to leave you with one spot, here. We're going to switch to another director at Big Fish. And let's see, we're going to look at, oh, actually, I'm going to show you two things because I just enjoy this so much. But let's look at this one. And we have choral music in the background and sound effects. So, but you'll want to watch and get the idea yourself. Simple, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, so going back, and we're going to go look at this last one. And you just came out of art history. Tell me what this reminds you of.
The Last Supper at McDonald's.
Too funny.
Hilarious.
Oh, look, they even lean in the directions.
Yes.
It's not just the Last Supper.
No.
It's the specific, that
It
one
is.
Last Supper of
Yes, Leonardo
Yeah.
da Vinci's,
doing
yes.
it. Yes.
Okay. There's a lot of great commercials to look at. So, you know, enjoy that.